You probably know Tamron for lenses like the 28-75 and the 35-150, but those are not the lenses I want to talk about today. Hidden behind the obvious choices are three designs that offer unusually strong value for completely different reasons. And the final one may be one of the most practical travel and wildlife zooms Tamron has ever made. I am your host here at AltBuzz Lenses, where we dig past the marketing and into the glass that actually earns its place in your bag. If stories like this keep you thinking twice before your next purchase, hit subscribe, because we are about to start with a lens most photographers do not even know how to search for. At number 3, we have the Tamron 20-40mm f2.8 Di III VXD. Built for full-frame Sony E-mount cameras, this lens carries a strange kind of invisibility. It is not wide enough to sit beside the familiar 16-35 or 17-28 crowd, and it does not stretch far enough to be mistaken for a standard 24-70. So when a photographer opens a search bar looking for a fast zoom, this lens rarely appears, not because it fails to deliver, but because nobody quite knows which shelf to put it on. That gap in the middle is exactly where its usefulness hides. 20mm gives you the breathing room for interiors, environmental portraits, and sweeping travel frames, while 40mm lands close enough to a natural, human field of view for street work and everyday documentary storytelling. Reviewers who have spent real time behind it describe a lens that stays sharp from corner to corner, even wide open, focuses close enough to flirt with detail work, and resists flare with a confidence that belies its size. Independent testing consistently praises how compact Tamron managed to keep this build while holding a constant f2.8 aperture across the entire range, a rare feat for a lens this size. What makes that achievement more striking is the physical footprint. Weather sealing is present but modest, enough to handle a light drizzle rather than a storm, and the filter thread stays common enough that photographers switching from other zooms will not need to rebuild their filter kit from scratch. Minimum focusing distance is close enough at the wide end that tabletop product work and tight environmental details both stay within reach, something a traditional 16-35 rarely offers as comfortably. Held next to a professional-grade 24-70, the difference in hand becomes obvious almost immediately. This is a lens built to disappear into a travel bag rather than announce itself. It is not without its compromises. There is no built-in optical stabilization, so you are leaning on the camera body to keep things steady in low light. 40mm will feel short if you are used to the reach of a standard zoom, and Sony shooters are not short on alternatives, with Sigma and Sony themselves crowding the same space. But for a photographer whose real working range already lives between 20 and 40mm, whether that is a wedding second shooter, a documentary traveler, or a hybrid video creator, this lens is not a compromise. It is a rare case of a company building exactly for a range most people did not know they needed until they used it. If a lens like this deserves more attention than it gets, you know what to do. Tap that subscribe button, because the next one takes us somewhere completely different. At number 2, we have the Tamron SP 35mm f1.4 DI-USD. This is not a strange modern zoom chasing an unconventional range. This is something almost the opposite, a full-frame prime built for Canon EF and Nikon F mount cameras, engineered with the kind of optical ambition Tamron reserves for its SP line, its most serious, most uncompromising designs. And it arrived in 2019, at almost the exact moment the photography world stopped paying attention to DSLR glass. Tamron did not build this lens as a budget alternative to first-party primes. They built it to compete with the best 35mm f1.4 optics on the market, chasing wide-open sharpness, tight control over chromatic aberration, clean chroma correction in the corners, and a rendering of out-of-focus light that photographers who shoot weddings and low-light portraits still talk about today. This was Tamron saying, quietly, that they could build a flagship prime as serious as anything from the major brands. The timing simply worked against them. Sony E was expanding fast. Nikon Z had just launched. Canon RF had just launched. Photographers everywhere were asking whether it made sense to invest in another DSLR lens at all, and a lens this ambitious ended up overshadowed by a mount transition rather than by anything wrong with the glass itself. Look closer at the optical construction and the ambition becomes even clearer. Tamron packed specialized elements into this design specifically to fight coma at the corners wide open, a problem that plagues most fast primes, and one that astrophotographers in particular notice immediately. Coma correction of this caliber rarely made it into third-party lenses at the time, which is part of why it earned quiet respect from photographers, who actually pushed it wide open in the dark, rather than judging it from a spec sheet. Autofocus, driven by Tamron's ultrasonic motor system, was tuned for accuracy over sheer speed, a choice that suited portrait and low-light shooters far more than it suited action photographers, and that distinction alone tells you exactly who this lens was built for. That history is exactly why it deserves a second look now. On the used market, this lens can be found for a fraction of its original price, and for photographers who already own Canon or Nikon DSLR bodies, or who are comfortable adapting glass onto mirrorless systems they already use, it offers a level of optical performance that modern lenses at the same price point often cannot match. It will not be for everyone. It is a large, heavy lens. There is no native version for RF, Z, or E-mount, and adapting it adds bulk that some photographers will not want to carry. But stripped of the mount politics, what remains is one of the most overlooked premium primes Tamron has ever released, sitting quietly in classifieds while photographers chase newer, smaller alternatives that do not always match what this one can do wide open. At number 1, we have the Tamron 50 to 400 mm 4.5 to 6.3 III VC VXD, built for Sony E and Nikon Z full-frame systems. This is the lens the hook promised you, and here is why it earns that promise. Most telephoto zooms force a choice. A 100 to 400 starts too long for anything nearby. A 200 to 600 is even more specialized, built almost entirely for distance. Tamron looked at that gap and built a lens that begins at 50 mm, practically a standard focal length, and stretches all the way out to 400, an 8x zoom ratio housed in a single piece of glass. What that 50 mm starting point actually changes is the story worth telling here. Picture a wildlife photographer on a trail who suddenly needs a wide environmental frame of the landscape, then a portrait of a fellow hiker, then a close detail of a flower at their feet, and finally a distant bird lifting off a branch, all without ever reaching for a second lens. That is the practical case for this zoom, and it extends into genuinely strong close-focusing performance at the wide end, close enough to flirt with near-macro detail work, though it should never be mistaken for a true macro lens. The stabilization and autofocus systems built into this lens are current-generation Tamron technology, not leftovers from an older design, which means tracking wildlife and handling 400 mm handheld is far more realistic than the focal range alone might suggest. A few practical details separate this lens from being merely clever on paper and actually usable in the field. It ships with tripod collar compatibility, a detail long lens shooters treat as essential rather than optional, since balancing an 8x zoom on a monopod without one quickly becomes exhausting. Tamron's lens utility software allows firmware updates and even some autofocus customization over USB, meaning the lens can evolve rather than freeze the moment it leaves the factory. Mount availability differs slightly between Sony and Nikon versions, so buyers already committed to one ecosystem should confirm compatibility with their specific body before assuming identical performance across both. And at its current retail position, the value question is never simply about the sticker price. It is about how many other zooms it quietly replaces in the bag you were planning to buy anyway. Wildlife photographers searching for their next telephoto usually type in numbers like 100 to 400, 150 to 500, or 200 to 600. Travel photographers search for 24 to 200, or 28 to 200. This lens sits in the space between both searches, which is precisely why so many photographers never find it. Independent testing shows it holds up well across most of its range, with the expected softening at the very long end that comes with any zoom this ambitious, and it competes conceptually against dedicated telephotos from Sony, Nikon, and Tamron's own longer lineup. It will not outresolve a purpose-built 200-600 at 400 millimeters. But the question was never whether this lens beats a specialist at one job. The question is how many separate lenses you no longer need to carry. And for a huge number of travel and wildlife shooters, the answer is enough to make this the single most quietly useful zoom Tamron currently makes. So which one surprised you the most? The 20-40 that refuses to fit a category, the 35 prime that arrived a few years too late, or the 50-400 that quietly replaces two lenses in your bag? Tell me in the comments, and while you are down there, let me know honestly, would you rather carry the flexibility of the 50-400 or stick with a dedicated 100-400 and a separate travel zoom? If this kind of deep dive into the lenses everyone else skips past is exactly what you come here for, subscribe, because there is always another overlooked lens waiting for its turn. Some lenses chase attention. These three earned it quietly, waiting in the space between the searches everyone else already knew to make, until the next one finds its way into the light. This has been Alt Buzz Lenses.